and labor are brought together in this series of lectures because they can be seen in a way as two sides of the same coin. Economic development requires work, and the laborers who do this work are not always available in the numbers required. As a consequence, immigration has often been seen in North America as the way to increase the pool of workers to fuel the engines of economic and national growth. While we could certainly consider the first wave of European colonizers as a generation of immigrants to North America, we've already addressed that topic well in previous lectures. So in this part of the lecture, I'd like to focus really on two later periods of immigration. The first is roughly from the late 1800s to the mid-20th century, while the second period we'll examine takes us from the mid-20th century to today. In this part of the lecture, I'm also going to focus much more on external immigration from outside North America to the continent. In part 4 of this lecture, we'll look more at migrations within North America. All three North American countries continued to receive immigrants in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but the scale of immigration to the United States was perhaps the most impressive in this period. From 1865 to 1910, 25 million immigrants chose the United States as their new home. Importantly, these immigrants were now coming increasingly from countries other than the British Isles, Germany, and Scandinavia. More and more, immigrants were arriving from Mediterranean countries, Eastern Europe, Russia, and the Balkans. To give just one example, from 1810 to 1900, about 1 million Italians settled in the United States. Then, in just the first decade of the 20th century, more than 2 million Italians immigrated to the US. And it was not just the Italians. Immigrants from Austria, Russia, and Turkey increased in astonishing numbers as well. As necessary as immigration was to foster economic development, it also now tended to provoke reactions from those already living in the US. Increasingly, the new immigrants arrived with different languages, religions, and cultures. Rather quickly, these strangers became the scapegoats for any and all ills in society, from unemployment to crime. To some, these immigrants were seen in racist terms as a threat to the American way of life. As a consequence, changes to immigration policy were first considered and then implemented to limit immigration in important ways. At first, those who were visibly different were the easiest to target. While they had played a critical role in building railways in the United States, the Chinese were among the first to feel the brunt of these changes in immigration policy. The United States passed the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, prohibiting the entry of Chinese laborers. Head taxes were also introduced, and these sorts of restrictive laws against the Chinese were maintained until 1943. The Japanese were also singled out for restrictive policies. In this instance, in 1907, the American government reached an agreement with Japan that would see that country stop the flow of immigrants to the US before they even left Japan. By 1924, the US had passed a new immigration act that excluded Japanese explicitly. Generally, throughout the 1920s, the US moved to provide immigration authorities with wide discretion in choosing who was suitable as an immigrant. And a series of quotas on the number of immigrants were put in place that significantly reduced the flow of people into the United States by 1929. In the same period, Canada experienced unprecedented levels of immigration as part of a concerted effort to expand the nation westward to the Pacific coast by settling people on the lands in the Prairie West. By now, much of the good farming land had been taken up in the United States, so Canada became a good second choice. The Canadian government focused primarily on attracting immigrants who would become good and successful farmers. Authorities clearly favored immigrants from the British Isles and Western Europe, first and foremost. When the supply of farming immigrants here dried up, those from Eastern Europe were also sought. This helps to explain the large number of Ukrainian Canadians in the western provinces today, for example. But, as in the United States, others who were visibly different were not welcome. The Chinese have been laboring pioneers in Canada just as they have been in the US. However, this did not stop the Canadian government from doing exactly what had been done in the United States. Head taxes were introduced to discourage Chinese immigration, and then when they did not prove to be effective quickly enough, virtually all Chinese immigration was banned by the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1923. As the Americans had done, the Canadian government also quietly worked out an agreement with the Japanese government to discourage any immigration from that country. Jews also faced discrimination, as did African Americans. The story in Mexico is different. While there had been attempts to attract immigrants, these were largely unsuccessful during the presidency of Porfirio Diaz. In fact, by 1910, there were only 116,000 foreigners living in Mexico. Most lived in the northern part of the country, working in agriculture and mining. When revolution did break out in Mexico in 1910, there tended to be strong anti-foreigner sentiment across the country. As had been the case in both Canada and the US, the Chinese faced the worst persecution. When the United States limited Chinese immigration, some Chinese turned to Mexico as an alternate destination, moving particularly to Baja and Sonora. By 1927, nearly 25,000 Chinese lived in Mexico, making them the second largest immigrant group after Spaniards. Still, they faced persecution. Laws were passed that banned intermarriage with Chinese, and also laws that enforced racial segregation. Some had their property seized, while others were even beaten and murdered. Immigration to all three North American countries changed dramatically after World War II. So we'll end this part of the lecture by looking at what happens across the continent in terms of immigration in the second half of the 20th century. In both Canada and the United States, during the late 1960s, the more blatantly racist, restrictive conditions in national immigration policies were removed. In the United States, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 allowed for a yearly ceiling of 170,000 immigrants from countries outside the Western Hemisphere and 120,000 immigrants from within the Americas. Asians and Europeans could now, in theory, apply on an equal footing with Europeans, and it would seem that revisions to the law did shift the demographics of immigration. In 1965, 90% of immigrants to the United States came from Europe. Just 20 years later, only 10% came from Europe. In the 1990s, the immigration ceiling was lifted to 700,000 for 3 years, and then lowered to 675,000. Much of this new immigration to the United States is Asian and Latino. Mexicans form the largest immigrant group, followed by Puerto Ricans and Cubans. In fact, the number of Latinos living in the United States had increased from 3 million in 1960 to 40 million by 2003. These numbers do not include undocumented immigrants. I'll come back to the question of undocumented migration in the last part of the lecture. While singled out and persecuted in earlier immigration policy, Asian immigrants to the United States increased rapidly in this period, more than doubling from 1980 to the mid-1990s. In Canada, immigration policy was dramatically reformed in 1967, when the country introduced a points system meant to remove provisions that allowed for the exclusion of potential immigrants on the basis of race. As a consequence, Canada now admits many more immigrants from Asia in particular. The Chinese Canadian and Indo-Canadian communities are the two largest immigrant communities today, representing 1.5% and 1.4% of the Canadian population. The total number of immigrants admitted to Canada has typically averaged about 250,000 a year, or just under 1% of the total population. Canada is still a predominantly white country. Nearly 77% of Canadians are white. The liberalization of immigration policy is, however, playing a role in changing this. In 1996, only 11% of Canadians identified as visible minorities. By 2011, this had increased to nearly 20%. Today, Canadians still feel ambivalent about immigration, reflecting perhaps the varying attitudes that have always existed. Opinion polls tend to consistently point to both positive and negative views of immigration. Cultural diversity and increased numbers of skilled workers are often cited as positive results of immigration, while other Canadians criticize immigration on the grounds that it leads to cultural enclaves and segregation, with the limited effort shown by immigrants to integrate fully into Canadian society, whatever that might be. We'll pick up on this theme later in the course when we discuss identity and citizenship. Finally, Mexico has also experienced significant immigration in the post-World War II period, but this has largely been through the mountainous regions of the southern part of Mexico, as hundreds of thousands of people fled civil unrest in in various parts of Central America throughout the 1970s and 1980s. Some chose to settle in Mexico, while others continued through the country into the United States. By the early 1990s, the Mexican and American governments were cooperating to step up efforts to stem the flow of this particular migration. Immigration is a complex topic. Labor has been critical to economic development and prosperity in North America, and throughout its history, the continent has relied on inflows of people from around the world to achieve this. This has been particularly true for the United States and Canada, and perhaps less so for Mexico. Yet this review of immigration also reveals blatantly racist views of immigrants at various points in time. And as we'll see in the next and final part of the lecture, racism is no less a factor to consider when we examine the movement of people within North America. That's it for now. We'll see you in part 4.